Hey, everybody. Welcome yet again to another Political Payne Live. It's August 27th, 7:29, 7:30 p.m., whatever you want to call it. My name's Joe Payne. I'm an independent journalist out of Santa Maria, California. And today for my Friday show, I usually do a kind of news of the week. And man, there's a lot of stuff to talk about. International news, war in Afghanistan, and the attack in Afghanistan. And of course, there's local stuff I could focus on too. But I'm really excited to do an interview tonight with the magnanimous, the fantastic C. Derick Varn. You might know him from his YouTube channel, C. Derick Varn, or the Varn Vlog. He was kind enough to have me on there. We're going to talk about shifting politics, your own personal politics. And Varn, what do people usually call you? Derick or Varn?
They call me Derick or Varn. I mean, it depends on if you know me politically or personally. Personally, Derick. Politically, Varn. It started probably when I told Douglas Lane not to call me by my last name, and so for the past 10 years, everybody has.
Of course.
So
J. Andrew World is here. C. Derick Varn, also a friend of the show, this show, but also the Bad Takes podcast. Thanks for being on there with us for that. That's the show I co-host with J. Andrew World. Hello, hola, J. Andrew World. Thanks for being here with us, buddy. I have a lot of different folks who watch my show. I do local news and I talk to other YouTube lefty people. But so I have a mix of an audience, a very small audience, obviously, right now. But, people who are, maybe generally identify with on the left. I have some locals around here or who just are Democrats or libs or whatever, you know what I mean? And may not understand or even think about themselves in the terms of leftists and understand the distinction. Normies, Varn, normies. So if you want to let people know where you're at now, and then we can go back in time in the Wayback Machine and start discussing how you got there.
I'm a left communist.
Yes.
So, good. I mean, what that means is I believe in workers' autonomy. I believe in national autonomy. I don't really believe that nation states are long-term viable, but unlike anarchists, I don't think you can just make them go away overnight. I sometimes joke that I'm a slow anarchist as opposed to an immediatist one. But unlike most left communists, I do actually engage in activism. I'm a member of a union. I have critiques of all these things, and I think they're highly limited, but they're what we have. I also have some sympathy to the idea that these monikers don't mean much anymore. I mean, left communism, for those who don't know, is part of a spectrum of socialists, which with the social democrats to the right, the Leninist parties on a spectrum in the center, and then the councilist, Bordigist, and some of the furthest left of the less opposition of the Bolsheviks and the left. Well, while the Chinese Communist Party still exists, and so I guess it might have some relevance to that, the idea of a spectrum organized around the USSR is kind of archaic and only maintained because our vocabulary comes from the 20th century. So when I say I'm a left communist, it's also with the caveat of most of what that means doesn't mean much anymore. So there's that. I'm not a Democrat. I have never, ? Voted for a Democrat. I may have in local elections, actually, because I make local decisions based off of strategic calculus that have nothing to do with whether there's a D, R, L, or I at the end of the name. Okay. But as far as on a national level, I voted for Mike Gravel in 2008. And
very cool.
I temporarily registered as a Democrat to vote for Bernie in 2020. So I guess I have voted for a Democrat in that one instance.
Yeah, an insurgent Democrat, but
right.
a Democrat nonetheless. Yeah.
But I voted for Bunny holding my nose because I also thought even if he won, he was going to fail. So that was, that's, that's where I'm coming from. And that's not a position that's particularly popular in the United States. But that's not where I come from. I didn't come out of, I didn't enter like far left politics until I was 29 years old.
Okay. And you're 40 now, right?
I'm 40, yeah.
Yes.
And I spent ages 19 to 25, so 1999 to 2005, as a paleoconservative.
Very good. And just for anybody watching who's not familiar, what in the world is a paleoconservative? I think hear it and I think Pat Buchanan, but what really, how would you?
Well, I mean, you thinking Pat Buchanan is accurate because Pat Buchanan's probably the most famous paleoconservative there is.
Yeah, he's the guy.
Paleoconservatism is actually kind of not so much an ideology as an orientation, and that can be hard to explain. For example, elements of paleoconservatism were in the Bannonite Trump agenda. Yeah. That's not what Trump actually did, but that was how he spoke. So paleoconservatives are not necessarily as sanguine on the free market. They do tend to have a relationship with paleo-libertarians, which is another group that's hard to break down. But they distrust the state. They tend to be, quote, isolationist, which is a position that has never really been popular in America, even in the, quote, isolationist period. And they can have a spectrum of opinions ranging from sort of low-key integralist nationalism, and I can explain what those terms mean, or what you might call national conservatism, all the way to socially conservative anarcho-capitalism on one branch of it, to borderline fascism on another branch of it. But what united them in the 2000s was an opposition to the neoconservative branch of the GOP. So we were an oppositionist kind of conservatism to official conservatism, at least in the 2000s.
Now, what would you say, like, really brought you into that world? What was, like, the linchpin? Because if isolationism, I know that's how I entered left politics when I was young, was through anti-war activism. And we should acknowledge, the situation in Afghanistan as the U.S. military is pulling out, the suicide bombing that killed more than 100 Afghans now and more than a dozen U.S. Marines. But, what was that like an entry point for you into paleoconservatism? Was the kind of anti-war or a really isolationist stance?
That was the linchpin of it, yeah. Mm-hmm. So what began it became... So my background and my temperament is not necessarily super left-wing. And that may still be true, actually, and I can talk about what that means.
I like that. Yeah, we'll get there.
But my background is working class. My mom became a nurse when I was 19 years old, so I was already an adult when my mother got her degree, and I entered college the same time myself. So I would have been the first person to graduate from college if my mother had not entered college when she was 36 years old, and she graduated when she was my age right now. Okay. I worked first as a pizza chef, then as a prison guard. My mother was a prison nurse. Wow. So I come out of that world. I grew up in the Deep South. I have a multiracial, multi-ethnic family, which complicates, and it actually probably was one of the 3 or 4 factors that really made paleoconservatism an inviable position for me. But so I grew up in a multi-ethnic family that was mostly working class. And by working class, I don't just mean in the Marxist definition of, productive to capital, depending on the general wage fund. I mean, in the cultural definition of blue collar, relatively uneducated, Southern. And I grew up basically down the road from J. Andrew World in a place called Macon, Georgia. I was born in Augusta, Georgia. My religious background is complicated, and so that's also a thing that complicates my relationship to paleoconservatism. But one thing to note about paleoconservatism in America is that it's overwhelmingly Catholic and Orthodox Christian with some Jews. And what am I? I come from a Catholic and Jewish background in a heavily Protestant area. So that's a lot of what informed where I come from. Why do
you think those religions interface with paleoconservative in that way?
Because paleoconservative in America has always been an oppositionist but conservative movement, and those religions are not part of the mainstream of American society, even though they're adjacent to it. So while today Catholicism is technically the largest religion in the United States, I mean, even more than Protestantism, I think if you took I actually don't think that's true. I think it's Protestantism's no longer over 50%. Catholicism is the largest group, but I think if you take the 25% of whatevers, and whatever being spiritual, non-religious, atheist, agnostic, Christian, don't go to church, etc. Catholicism is the largest singular group, but it's not. I don't think it actually outnumbers all the Protestants together, but it's coming pretty close.
President's a Catholic.
Yes. So I grew up in that world. Catholicism also has treated capitalism as a heresy. So there's a strong and long conservative anti-capitalism in Catholicism that ranges from the Christian worker movement, which is very much a kind of quasi-anarchist movement, all the way to distributism, and then to, frankly, Catholic integralist fascism, which is non-racial fascism. And all those have a complicated relationship to capitalism, but none of them see capitalism in its laissez-faire or neoliberal form. And those are separate forms, by the way, if I'm being technical, as like a good.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm also bookish. I'm well read. I'm real read and conservative and left and liberal ideas. I actually think education made me more conservative, believe it or not, because I thought a lot of the people who were around me were stupid. And they were all left liberal postmodernist. This was the late 90s, early aughts. And I saw them as not really having any real beliefs. Frankly, I thought that their leftism and liberalism was a cover for a libertine lifestyle, not really any actual political commitment. And what started me down this path was I came out of the zine culture, working class zine culture, but zine culture of the late 90s. We would steal Xerox, copies and make stuff with access codes from our richer friends' parents, and
Yeah,
and that was
in high school. That
was a very anarchist left scene, and that did influence me. I knew who Chomsky was and was reading him very early. Probably I was 16 or 17. I was involved in I would get on listservs when I would go to the library and log into the listserv for Rage Against the Machine.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Old school. Yeah. Listservs.
But a bunch of my friends and I, who were all, adjacent to this left scene in the late 90s, we were all by my standards now working class, but I was blue collar and my friends were kind of lower white collar, but from the standpoint of a teenager, that feels much bigger than it does now. And we all went to, well, three of us went to the battle for Seattle because it was written about in all these zines.
Wow, yeah.
And well, you know, two of my friends came away with excitement, although one would later become a Christian, which was a common story where I'm from. And the other would become a liberal. And then I reacted to it with disgust because I was like, this has nothing to do. You know, I'm coming here to support this movement because I believe in like working class poor people and peasants in other parts of the world.
Remind people what the Battle of Seattle was about, and then tell us like what disgusted you about it.
So it's the G8
Yes.
protest. And the Battle for Seattle was kind of like mini Occupy. There's Black Bloc there. There was Pat Buchanan was there. I mean, there was all kinds of people there. It was an anti-globalization protest. Yep. And what attracted me to anti-globalization was kind of a vague sense of anti-imperialism, but not based off of like any kind of Marxist logic, but based off this idea that people should be more or less left alone. And that I knew that trade deals were unfair. I responded to that out of like a moral capacity. I had also known about the School of the Americas. It's down the street from where I live, which is way far south of your colleague J. Andrew World, but down in Fort Benning.
Okay.
And I think it's been something else since 1999, but I still think of it as School of the Americas because we would protest that in high school. And I had family. Two of my uncles had both served in the military in Vietnam and Korea. One of them had married a Korean woman, and they have both soured on the war. And I don't talk about this a lot because, both my uncles have problems. I mean, by problems, I mean, if you read Hillbilly Elegy and take out all the editorializing J.G. Vance does, like that's my uncles. So they're rednecks, they're ex-military, they were highly disturbed people, one of which is still alive, the other which died really young, about 5 years older than I am now. Drug addictions, diabetes, alcoholism, what you'd normally expect from the region. And that had conservatized me. I came up in a world where if you were a libertarian, I mean not a libertarian politically, but if like you had a libertarian attitude, and you got on opioids or alcohol and you died. So like that informed where I came from. I had already lost people at 19 years old. So I saw all these people out in Seattle, which was, the year before that. And I was just like, this is not serious. These are a bunch of rich West Coast bullshitters who are protesting something that I don't entirely think they understand. Now, I was an arrogant 18-year-old, shithead. I'm not going to lie. But that was my initial response. But that wasn't what fully turned me. What fully turned me is I was not really conservative or liberal or left. At 1920, I was kind of confused. And 9/11 happened, the war in Afghanistan happened, and then the sequel to the G8 protest happened. And my liberal friends, I tell this story, I've told it a couple of times, but my liberal friends decided that they should
you want to react to that comment? You're getting distracted.
Yeah, I hate comments. Universalism and internationalism. I would say sort of, but I would also say that internationalism is a vaguely defined term and that most people in the United States don't have a clear vision of it. So what I would say to what happened in 2001, 2002 is my liberal friends decided the heat would be too high at this protest at Sea Island, which was a sequel to the protest we had went to in Seattle, and almost no one was there. We got rounded up in like a protest cages, international, free speech zones. International Answer was there, which was this kind of group that would later be led by the PSL. I think at this point it was led by the WWP. They were Trotskyist at this time, but they would say stuff like full military support for the Taliban. And even though I thought the Afghan war was stupid and we should leave the Taliban alone, that like the idea that we would military support someone that I would have considered a reactionary force because of some kind of vague Marxist revolutionary defeatism, which was not explained well to me at the time, it just struck me as stupid and a way to alienate everybody in the room. And so there were these other people there. They were also anti-war professors. They were well dressed. They were well mannered. They were local, and they were not college people with purple hair. And I say this as a person who had purple hair at the time, but that was a different signifier in 1999. And I spoke with them and I started reading their website, which was a website around what they were interested in, which was antiwar.com and LewRockwell.com. Lew Rockwell is a paleo-libertarian magazine, which is where it was introduced to like the Ron Paul movement before it even ran for president and after its neo-Confederate period. So it's kind of a sweet spot of not knowing everything about it.
Sounds like it. Jeez.
And
I was not. Wait, Ron Paul had a neo-Confederate period?
He himself did not, but people who wrote for his journal or his newsletter did. I mean, it was actually probably Luke Rockwell who was the person who was the offender there, but that's never been proved.
Okay. Wow.
So I got interested in conservative anti-war activism. I got interested in people like Pat Buchanan and Joe Sobran, who were kicked out of the National Review for what I thought at the time was principled stances on foreign policy. I read books like Gore Vidal, which really resonated with me. And if people remember at the time, he was defending even Timothy McVeigh. But I also read Pat Buchanan's Republic Not an Empire. And that really resonated with me.
Anti-imperialism from the right.
Right. And I also just didn't find I know this is really strange, but I don't come from a totally uneducated background, but the immediate, like the last 3 generations of my immediate family were not. But when I had idolized education until I was like 19 years old, I've been taught that was our way out of the kind of crap hole that we lived in. I believed them. And when I met all the college kids, and particularly as I got higher and higher up, and eventually I'm like meeting Ivy League people, they were such jokes. Like, they weren't intellectually that super serious. And they also, frankly, were snobby and were totally in contradiction of themselves. I remember sitting in a class in 2002 about education. This was before I decided to be a teacher. And I had someone telling me about how we needed to diversify education while they were also going to the upper suburbs of North Atlanta to recruit for the university. Now, I don't know if you know Georgia enough for what that means, but that's basically going to like the richest, whitest areas of the state to recruit while talking about diversifying the university. So I just thought they were hypocrites.
Well, they tend to be. They very easily can be. You know, a liberal can very easily be hypocritical. You know,
this was also a time where like the left and liberal, despite what like the WWP, PSL, or ISO was telling you, I mean, the true left organizations were no more than 4,000 or 5,000 people at most, and they were probably more like 2,000. So they were tiny. They were full of nothing but college students and old people. So you would go to these meetings and you'd see like old timers who were still obsessed with 68 in the 70s, and then and they're all, unfortunately, a lot of them are dying now, but.
Yeah. That's how when I started protesting the war when I was young, it was pretty much entirely just us kids, maybe a couple of the kids' dads, boomers, and then a lot of 68ers, golden generation people who were kind of part of that, and
yeah, I come from a very reactionary generation, but I always try to defend it. I'm a Gen Xer, but I always try to defend it. I always try to defend it in that 1992 happened and no one had an answer for anything. And also that we've been steeped in government failure and government brutality from the MOVE bombing to Ruby Ridge, which I actually see as a spectrum of the same thing, which is still unpopular on the left. But even as a kid, I did. I was very passionate about how unfair what happened to Mumma Abu-Jamal was, even as a conservative, while also kind of thinking we wouldn't have called it woke, even though that was a word, but all the postmodernist jargon was a joke. This only got worse because as I got up the education ladder, I climbed up the class ladder, kinda. So I started having friends who came from real money as I got educated. And I also noticed my world got wider and wider, despite the fact that everyone talked more about anti-racism. So it was really hard for me to talk. I'd have friends who come and lecture me about how there was, well, you have black bars and white bars, and we don't have that in Ohio. And I'm like, bro, you have the Klan in Ohio and you don't have enough black people to have black bars. So what are you even talking about? You don't even know what you're dealing with. And so I was responding not only to local liberals, but also Northwestern and Rust Belt liberals who were coming to the South to go to a cheap school. And they were doing the whole defending their own class origins by shitting on people who they thought were lower than them. And those people happened to be my people. So that lasted until 2004, 2005. And so this is not a huge period of my life, but it was super formative. It was entirely throughout college. That was a kind of anti-war activism I was involved in. I still, to this day, often think that paleo-conservative journalism on the military is actually better than left journalism.
Even because they know the military.
They know the military more. You're less likely to get stuff that's totally framed in ideological jargon.
I went over our local Air Force base, just turned into the Space Force base, the Vandenberg Space Force base near Lompoc. And they had a bunch of people in Star Wars costumes, legit people got dressed up as stormtroopers to celebrate Space Force and the new Space Force base. And probably the best, raking them across the coals I found was a military blog, because they just knew exactly how to cut into them. You used the term reactionary earlier. Could you define that for my audience? And then what, I understand the whole idea of you seeing poverty and addiction and PTSD and what that does to people or love, right? And transmuting that into a reactionary kind of stance, but what is that and how did it kind of play out for you?
So for me, reactionary is different from conservatism. Conservatism is a defensive posture. It understands itself to be a defensive posture. I actually think conservatism in the US is kind of dead. And
what do you mean by that?
I mean that the defensive posture of it representing the status quo is over. And in fact, if I was to say anyone, the center of the Democratic Party is the conservative faction in the United States now. And I don't just mean that in ideological substance. I mean that in orientation. They see themselves as defending a kind of American status quo against reactionary forces and against leftist ones.
Yes, that's a helpful way of framing it.
Reactionaries are more proactive and are not necessarily interested in conserving a way of life so much as imposing a different one. They are often what I consider negative utopians, or they are nostalgic. However, I will say that I find a lot of left positions in the United States temperamentally reactionary in so much that they are based on nostalgia and responding to something else. So what is the left? Well, that's actually the vaguest position in a lot of ways, because the left is not a negative or defensive temperament. It's a positive temperament, but it's a positive temperament that has many different things that are associated into it, some of which are only tangentially related if we're honest. Mm-hmm. So while racism has been historically part of capitalism, one can be an anti-racist and not an anti-capitalist. Mm-hmm. At least in the superficial way. I know someone might say, well, you can't be an anti-racist and a capitalist in the deep way. Well, that may be true, and I may actually agree with that. But in the way that people commonly understand the term, they definitely can. Similar to with feminism, I think even more so with feminism, because you don't have the same kind of wealth debarment disparity that with inheritance that you do with racial disparity in the U.S., particularly in regards to Black and Indigenous people. So those are things that that can come up as other concerns. But I've never been particularly sanguine on capitalism, because the community I grew up with, I'd always hear libertarian stuff and free market stuff, but all I saw was that if you weren't near a state contract, you would starve. So that you either entered the military or you're dependent on the military indirectly through state contracts. And then all the other industry in the area was also dependent on those state contracts. Furthermore, I started doing research into, and I think leftists are actually really bad at this. So I started doing research into things that I think leftists would know. For example, the average white person in the South made less than the average Black person in the North if they had access to unionized jobs. Now, what I didn't know at the time was the reason for that is because of racism and the fact that yellow card, which is racist, unionism was normalized in the South. You could always use the Black population as strike breakers. And the reason why you could is because you could and it actually created new white groups. So like the Welsh, the Manx, the Cornish, later on the Italians were whiteified by having Black workers being brought in by capitalists to break their strikes. That was really big in Appalachia, not so much in the Tidewater, but it's something that I only understood half of. So I knew that like the workers in the North, and this is something people can look up, made a lot more money because they were unionized, but they didn't let us unionize in the South. So, for example, I was skeptical on unions because my brother had been in one and my dad was really skeptical of them. They're both blue collar people. But I had noticed that the places that had unionized the workers did better. So I was like, okay, but they didn't let us do it. So they were obviously trying to keep us down. Which I actually think is true, but it wasn't I didn't have the full scope and racial context for what was going on, in the way the kind of what we would now call in Marxist terms, the contradictions of like the bourgeois North's liberal agenda really was. So the South, for example, before we started moving textile mills overseas is where all the textile mills were, because wherever you have the shittest labor, that's where you put the textile mills. That's what you do.
Yep.
It's textile mills and mining. We weren't allowed to do a whole lot else of industrial labor till the 50s and 60s, and most of that was actually agricultural processing, such as canning, tobacco farming, etc. And I knew all that history. I also knew that all the military bases were in our area.
That's what I was just going to say. I've heard you talk before about military Keynesianism. And, I know folks who live in Huntsville, which like Eisenhower basically created, out of whole cloth, this missile capital. And, a lot of people understand politics in a personal way. And I think economics, this is what, there are a lot of leftists today who I think are becoming so because they are responding to their environment, the economic environment, right? We're living through a second economic downturn as a millennial. I'm 8 years younger than you.
Or fourth.
Yeah. Depending on, you're a cusp, right, on the Gen X or
I graduated into a recession, and then went to grad school. Got out of grad school in the Great Recession, became a teacher, lost my job as a teacher 3 years later because it's 3 years downstream of the market, if you understand how tax rebates work in the state, so that hits later. Left the country for 10 years and came back. Well, 8.5 years and came back.
Yeah.
So I was gone for I was gone for almost all the Obama administration. This is another thing to know about me. I missed all that. I watched it from abroad, and I had come in as a person who was somewhat sanguine on Obama. I had been a Mike Gravel supporter when that fell through, and he went to the Libertarian Party to try to leftify it. I laughed and saw that Bob Barr, a former neoconservative, was going to win. So I went and backed up. I went and through my canvassing unit, went and helped Obama. I continued to go with them. As soon as Obama appointed his cabinet, before he even assumed office, while all my friends were celebrating in the street, I was depressed because I'm like, we're not going to see any change. And by the time the Gitmo cowardice hit in, I'm like, we're definitely not going to see any change. I remember all these things very vividly. But I came out of this school of anti-war conservatism. I was very influenced by American Conservative Magazine. I was very influenced by Gary Wills, who would become a liberal later on, but had worked for the National Review as a Catholic conservative. And like I mentioned, Joe Sobran and Pat Buchanan, they all kind of went different ways. Joe Sobran died, but around the time of his death, I realized that he was a rabid anti-Semite. So
Kenzo's here. Hey, Kenzo Shibata.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, the Arn Duncan thing is something I never forgave him for, and I've actually kind of been mad at how we've erased a lot of the inability to deal with education that the Obama administration just sat on its hands for. And
as a teacher, I think you have a very interesting point of view on that, but you teach at a charter school, right?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. I thought I misheard.
I used to teach at a charter school several years ago.
Okay. I think I heard you talk about that once.
I teach at an experimental, completely public program right now. Cool. That is hybrid, and mostly online for people who want to take it, because Utah is not a place that closes the schools during COVID. We just apparently don't care. But the district did offer choice, and we figured out a way to do it legally without becoming a charter. So that's where I work. I've worked in public schools in traditional, regular brick and mortar public schools for 5 years, at different periods of my life. I've worked at elite private schools. I worked at universities, and I spent 2 years out of my life when I came back to the United States at a charter school.
You alluded really quick to shifting, or the things that got you out of the right, like the racial stance, right? And different things. Was there a moment where you or a time where you went back to the left, or did you go immediately to where you are now? I doubt you did. You said earlier you're bookish. I know that history, like your study of history, plays into this quite a bit.
So my way out of it was long and complicated. I got involved with the New Atheist movement for a very brief period of time.
Okay.
Back when it was pivoting itself as liberal.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I was also going through various economic theories. I had been exposed to neoclassical economics, Austrian economics, and Joseph von Mises and von Hayek Geis's, monetarism, Keynesianism, and none of them convinced me of anything. This obsession had started. I'd taken a couple of economics classes as an undergrad, and I was really good at it. But I didn't want to do that. I had an artsy soul, or some stupid shit like that. Actually, what I wanted to be was a lawyer and a writer. And so I got hired at a large, unnamed, vaguely lizard-esque insurance company. And you can figure out which one that is. Okay. As an accounts receivable actuarial tech.
Oh boy, I could just imagine Varn in the cubicle with the tie, and like Office Space. All right, we're getting
Yeah,
the
it was
origin story.
very much like that, actually. And so I was going through insurance law and learning and trying to teach myself economics as a 23-year-old. And because I was good at accounting, but I was like, okay, I can see that the government doesn't work like a private accounting firm. That's clear to me. But both the conservatives and the Keynesians at the time, no one saw the housing crisis coming. So in 2005, my brother, who was unemployed, got a loan for a house that was $80,000, which I guess in now terms is not a lot of money, but for Georgia with no background seemed insane. Yeah. And I started looking at I just got married. I got married pretty young my first time. My wife and I were looking at the housing market and just going, why are they building houses and cow pastures in places that don't have a lot of work? Like, it seems like the work is building houses. That's a weird circular thing. And this is 2004. So for a lit magazine I worked for called Unlikely Stories 2.0, I wrote a brief article just talking about my observations about like, why are all these suburbs opening up in places that that I can't imagine can actually support them. Wow. I bet there's something weird going on. 2006 starts to happen, 2007 happens, and I feel vindicated. But what I do is during this time period, I start going back into economic history. And the only people who spoke to the problem that I saw were Marxist and Nouriel Roubini. All right. So one kind of conventional, kind of dour left Keynesian that no one listens to now, but I actually think to their detriment. And like Marxists, the Austrians who believed in the business cycle and talked about it later had actually all been sanguine in the earlier period. So I started looking at people who were talking about economic crisis and found Marx. Now, I first started reading crisis theory and I kind of threw it away because I was like, well, if capitalism was going to end from crisis theory, it would have ended in 1920. But I started reading other Marxist theory. And then I looked at the tendency of the rates of profits to fall, and I started looking at both raw commodities and finished industrial commodities, as opposed to things that are rents and rent seeking. In the paleoconservative and libertarian world, there is actually a reaction, like a group of the most radicals who reject intellectual property altogether. Wow. because it requires state intervention. All right. Okay. And the reason why it requires state intervention is the form of rent. Ironically, these far right libertarians are actually come to a similar position to Marxists. We also realize that this is a form of rent. But the Marxist story made more sense to me. It explained my life more and spoke more to where I came from. That we were the people who were producing things, that we were sold a bill of goods, that we largely had no other choice but to accept the bill of goods, particularly after the 1920s. And so I started studying American labor history and American racial history. The other thing is I decided after a year of corporate hellhole being corporate hellhole that I wanted to go back to school, but I didn't want to be a lawyer because I heard that there was like, even in the aughts, there's like something like one lawyer for every three. I mean, no, reverse that. 3 lawyers for every 1 job or something really awful. So, and I had hated the legal part of my job as an insurance person. So I went back and got my MFA in poetry. I figured, well, hell, I took 2 weird degrees to do a practical job. I might as well do whatever the hell I want. And
humanities, man.
Yeah, I got my MFA. I was an adjunct professor at a bunch of different schools and was not making ends meet. And I started like ballooning up. Healthcare was a major problem for me. It had been my whole life, actually. Like, I've always been sickly. And a bunch of my friends started coming home from the war because I'm from Central Georgia. And so a lot of people, this was back before 2008, 2009, the poverty draft was a real thing. And after 2010, it was not nearly as much of a thing. And I could talk about why. But during this time period, a lot of my poorer friends, their only way out of the area we lived in where there was no jobs was to go into the military. So they came back fucked up. Now I've been opposed to the war the whole time. But I thought that my country would take care of them.
I remember Walter Reed happening around this time as well, and just like how kind of open it was. I knew people who enlisted and were just completely like, it was not what we thought it was, yeah, and Walter Reed.
Very few people I came back from the war were super sanguine on the Afghan or the Iraq war.
Mm-hmm.
Very few. I did not know many people who came back jingoistic unless they weren't. I did have some family who were special forces who ironically didn't see that much. One of the things I learned is the more you were trained in the military, the less likely they were to actually use you while they were trying to throw as many bodies at this war as they could, particularly in the aughts, because in the aughts, the military was trying to do everything on the cheap. So they were activating reserves, which is the opposite of what we were always told they were for, to go and fight first.
I remember. I remember that.
So like a lot of the people I knew who were career military didn't even see the war until like 2007, 2008. But people that I knew who had just kind of were like, had been National Guard or reserves had gone in 2002. So all this stuff really affected me. And the paleo conservatives spoke to a lot of it, but they didn't speak to the economic stuff at all. And their view of class relations and relations between races started to really like seem totally idealistic to me. Like the people I knew just didn't believe in this stuff. And also, I've never been naturally inclined to U.S. patriotism. Maybe because I'm Southern, maybe because I'm part Jewish or whatever. I don't identify with the entirety of the country. I identify with the region that I'm in at the time. So I was a very proud, I mean, I know you don't hear it now. I don't even have an accent anymore, but I was a very proud Southerner. And very defensive of it.
Yeah, I have my own regional pride. I always thought that was silly, like that idea of I'm from here, you're from there, screw you. But you get older and then you experience. For me in my area of California, I live in an agricultural valley. It's very like blue collar town. It's where the affordable house. It's a bedroom community for a lot of the richer like cities nearby. But then like you don't have to drive too far. You get closer to Santa Barbara, which is where like Oprah and royals are living, and you start to get like class shock or people like treating you or just kind of eyeing you up and down, as you walk into the whatever bougie wine tasting place and all that shit. You talked about new atheism earlier, and that was kind of, I felt, for me, was where I spent a good amount of my 20s, like kind of mired, almost like in an intellectual kind of death spiral, like one of those ant death spirals, right? And this is kind of a question I avoided when I was on your show, right? I not consciously, but how did I get to where I am? And I was always, anti-war left lib, but then there was a brief moment there around 2014, maybe going into 2015, where I was a little bit taken in because I was into new atheism and watching the Hitchens videos and all that shit. And then Sam Harris is the only like one putting out regular content with his podcast, getting sucked into reactionary thinking and some of their reactionary stuff.
I was a Peter Hitchens new atheist, which was always funny.
that is,
but I mean, like seriously, I really was like my politics were very close to Peter Hitchens. I just didn't really believe in God, and
wow, you're like to the two brothers mixed.
Yeah, and in fact, ironically, I would say to people like, if I could believe in God, I would. I just can't do it, which is more or less true. Like I really tried. So
it doesn't make sense. I've always kind of thought that way, and for a while it seemed like politics because so much of the American right and the Republicans are characterized by evangelical Christian dominionists, right? And Mike Pence,
right.
as an
But people
example.
used to say that about George Bush, and I'd be like, no, he's laughing at you. I even thought this as a kid. Like, he's using that's totally cynical. He doesn't really believe any of that. Like, he thinks you're rubes. And like, even though he's got a Texas accent, that he's really a blue blood Connecticut New Englander in his core, and his affected his affected working class accent is totally an affectation from a clipped jaw. So like, that was my response to that. So
and that I remember even comprehending that when I was young and in high school, because I was in like 8th grade when 9/11 or 7th or 8th grade when 9/11 happened. So much of like,
I was a junior in college, just so people know the difference in our age and perspective.
Yeah, of course. But like the Bush years, the Patriot Act, not just Afghanistan, but then later Iraq, Rumsfeld, Cheney, I'd love to get your thoughts on Afghanistan and what you think it's going to do, like if it's going to lead to another kind of reactionary moment like post-Vietnam, or I tend to think the reactionary right movement happened within Vietnam. I think it's Nixon. I think
we're in the middle of 50-year counter-revolution that's about to be clinched, frankly. And I don't necessarily think it's going to be clinched by Trumpists or like people think either, because one of the things that this is going to do in regards to Afghanistan is popularize the right wing of the Democrats and the quote left wing of the Republicans, because they are realist on foreign policy, unquote. So what that's going to mean is the old neoconservatives are going to have a way to look legitimate again, because they're largely not in the U.S. Like, even people I know who were like middling Christian conservatives, there are people very close to me whose parents are like this, who have started talking about like how American imperialism is bad. And my parents, my stepfather, as a mechanic, I would venture to say was kind of a low-key conservative, not an outright reactionary on certain issues. The war, the end of the Bush years broke him so much that he started like not talking the kind of veiled semi-racist stuff he talked around me as a kid, and then was more looking at Obama. And then the response to that pushed him further and further to the liberal left, in his 60s. So that was a part of that was happening in my family, but like, it was an interesting change.
Wow.
The other thing I would say is I worked in prisons. That turned me against the prison system. Also, I've had two very close families of mine in and out of prison, family members of mine, one uncle and two brothers who've been in and out of the U.S. penal system. Having that intimate knowledge of it, even when I was a conservative, I literally thought caning was a more humane option than prison. And I was a prison abolitionist before it was cool. Like, okay. I was like, I would say before it was cool. I mean, I really meant this. I'm like, no, I think we should, like, I'm okay with public torture as long as we don't kill anyone. As long as we don't send them to prison, because it does less damage. That's how messed up prisons are. Like, and, because, I knew people who would go into the prison system and they come out way more hardened criminals, way more abused by the system, way more distrusting of all society, kind of half broken. Yeah. And the people who worked in it, it totally deteriorates who you are. I wasn't in it for very long, but when I'll tell you what, one of the other things that I realized when it was starting to turn me left. So I found this economic stuff. This is around 2005. I start predicting this. I start reading Marxist leftist theory. I discover proto-MMT, which I kind of reject. And then I discover Marxist writings, and they make a lot of sense of what I'm seeing. Although at the time I'm like, well, Marx has a good critique of capitalism. I need to understand this better. But the USSR obviously sucked because it couldn't even sustain itself past 1992. And I remembered that happening as a kid. That was a primal event of my childhood. Like the wall falling down, Chernobyl, Yeltsin. That was all on TV when I was a kid. Tiananmen Square. And I'll admit, I have a visceral reaction even today to like people who are super naive about other countries because who like don't remember this time period, even though I think a lot of what I got in the United States was borderline propaganda. Or maybe not even that borderline, frankly. So like, yeah. So this was all, this was coming out. So I was reading Marx. I'm like, well, Marx is right about what's wrong with capitalism, but no one's talking about it. We're all talking about Derrida, Foucault, Al Franken, Michael Moore, who all just seem like arrogant dipshits to me. Who just seem to make fun of like the people that I came from. And so I kind of felt like I was in the wilderness. I'm like, well, these socialists seem to be right about what capitalism does in a way that like the arguments that I only heard from the paleoconservatives are even like the populist leftists, like Tom Frank, who, may be Marxist adjacent now, but at the time it was all just moral talk, like Chris Hedges, making moral talk about corruption. And I was going, even at the time I was going, this doesn't seem like it's corrupt to me. This seems like this was what was always supposed to do.
For me, that time, like the mid 2000s, I remember hearing the words, the corporations, but not, it's the capitalism, right? And so for me, anti-capitalist critique didn't come till much later. Socialism didn't come till much later, because you're right. It was like the discourse was a bit frozen in this, like, I mean, the left was so helpless anyway that it was just like looked at as, we're just completely hopeless. There's nothing we can do. We're just lying here prone, with our necks exposed all the time. And it's the corporations, it's the campaign finance, it's the Bilderberg group. You start getting into this
stuff, right? If you believe that stuff, you also start realizing that like paleoconservatives say the same shit, and they say it more smart. So. I mean, like when they're railing against Walmart and like paleoconservatives, like, this is just what capitalism does. Like it deletes communities. We need small businesses, but we have to deal with the cost of small businesses. So we need deflation. How do we handle deflation? Blah, blah, blah. I mean, like some of these things now I think would objectively be economically horrible, but like it makes sense. Whereas you just hear, corporations are bad. And you're like, yeah, but I can't afford shit and Walmart's cheaper. What are you talking about? Like I can't go to the boutique down the street and buy stuff. Like, yeah, it'd be great if I had enough money to support all the workers who had cool boutique jobs. And also, those jobs give less benefits and kind of suck. And so that was my response. So I felt like I was out in the wilderness in 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009. Still anti-war, still had a lot of support. There's a lot of anger at Bush. I heard Mike Gravel talking, and that was the closest thing to my politics. But I felt totally alone.
So anti-capitalist, Marxist, socialist, was there a shift from there to left comm as you are now?
Yeah, it was not an immediate shift. I had been keeping up with like left-wing anti-imperialist theory for a long time. And then I started getting deep into Chinese history. Chinese history first, not Russian. I became a Russianist, like a lay Russianist later. Cool. When I was abroad. But I started studying this while I was also being a teacher. And the other thing I noticed when I was a teacher, and it was impossible to deny, is that I taught plenty of really smart black kids. My school was about 45% black, 10% Hispanic and Asian, and then about 45% white. It was like a weird balanced scenario. And also because for whatever reason, there was no private school in the county for the white kids to just abandon the school for. We did not have white flight in the same way, at least not then. And it was also super economically diverse. The public school had rich neighborhoods on one end of it. This county was huge. And then poor black and working class white neighborhoods on the other end, trailer parks, former projects that have been vaguely privatized, but when I say it, very vaguely. So I worked in this school, and I would go into the classroom and notice my poor white kids and my black kids, regardless of their income, were not really in the upper echelon classes. They didn't know how to negotiate the social stuff to get in those classes.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't even that people were trying to keep them out. In fact, there was a section of teachers that really wanted to diversify those classes, but all they could do to do that would be like, we're going to make all the classes. This would happen in the neighboring city. We're gonna make all classes AP classes, and that'll just make everybody better. And I was just like shaking my head.
Cyril and Whiskey says, where Marx is lacking along with everyone else is that we're on a globalized fiat system. Nobody ever planned for this or has any idea what can replace it. I don't know what you think of that, Varn.
Marx did not predict globalized fiat currency because he didn't think a state would ever be powerful enough to enforce it upon other countries in the way that we can. That's true. He did actually predict a globalized system because capitalism, in fact, most systems are international. So to get back to my story, though.
Sorry about that.
So I actually got some of my best black female students. Got them high ACT, SAT scores, working with them. Just really devoted for it. Because I also remember where I lived, if you were a black student and you didn't graduate, like your chances of going to prison were 50-50. Right?
Damn.
And so like that, I had this moral imperative. I'm like, I got to do what I got to do because my brothers, I'm like, we've wronged this community. Even again, I was coming out of my conservatism, but I always had a sense that that what the white people had done in the United States was steal land and oppress people through generational wealth. But I also thought, and I actually still think this, and I wish leftists would look at it more, that not all white people were all equally guilty of that. Like that there was generational wealth problems with us too, and it was like comparing apples to oranges to kumquats. But I couldn't deny that it was systemically more aimed at black people. And this narrative that I had quasi-internalized, even though I didn't realize it, that the problems were cultural. So what I believed as a paleo-conservative was that the problems that stem from the black community were poverty culture problems. Mm-hmm. I didn't think they were black culture problems, but I didn't think they were poverty culture problems, and that they could be undone culturally. We just have to work on the culture of poverty around this area. Whereas I have the reverse now. So I see the culture of poverty being tied to the economic imperatives, and it's still being deleterious. And I don't think it's good. I think a lot of people romanticize poverty on the left in ways that made me want to slap people around. But but I used to joke that I was a socialist because I hated poverty, not because I loved the poor. Like,
that's
but that I would come out and see all this and just go like, no, this is not cultural. Like some of these people, some of these students of mine, they can code switch total white, they can put on their white voice, they can do the whole thing. They don't have the wealth to get ahead. They just don't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like I didn't either. Like I had to I couldn't take scholarships at good schools and stuff. When I had to go to state school. I still have issues because I've been school shamed by leftists, even after I was a leftist. This was a big, when I went to Occupy Wall Street and was in New York, and people were shaming me because my Mandarin was bad. And I'm like, I was in Korea on my own. I had to work. I went to college pretty much on my own. And I went to state school. They didn't even offer any Asian language but Japanese, why would I take that? So like, I'm not an otaku or something.
Were they shaming you for where you did go or for where you didn't go?
They shamed me for not speaking adequate Mandarin, even though I lived in Korea.
Jeez. I mean,
It was a crime think anarchist that I met at an Occupy thing when I was a professor who had only reason I could even afford to go to my home country again was that I was able to get my school to pay for it to go to a conference, and that conference put me in DC. And so during Occupy, I took a bus trip up to New York and stayed with some friends, and they just made me feel poor. And it was really hard for and they were Marxist and anarchists who went to Sarah Lawrence and NYU. And I remember all my paleo-conservative rage coming back up and being like, you guys are class enemies. You know, I no longer actually feel that way. I could talk to you about why. I'm like a skeptic of the PMC thesis for that reason. But but when you're dealing with relative immiseration, people who seem to have a lot more than you, but are still close enough in your orbit and are trying to differentiate themselves from you because the last thing they want to be seen is downwardly mobile white trash too. And that you're a threat to them because, like, you know, you climbed up but still have some affectations and your education's not perfect and you don't like that's that has a sociology that you have to deal with that leftist groups often don't. I think a lot of the PMC narrative actually today, which I am familiar with from paleoconservatism, because that was our class politics.
Yeah.
The elite.
The liberal elite. Yeah.
The liberal elites had usurped the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie. The entrepreneurial bourgeoisie was decadent out to lunch, and they had farmed everything out to bureaucrats and academics, and that they had become a managerial class, and that they were the liberal elites keeping us all down. And my experience of school was the same thing. So when I will tell you that one of my gut reactions to PMC talk is that it's conservative, because it reminds me of the stuff that I was told as I was a conservative. I don't think it's all false, by the way. Like, I think what's false about it is it has an overly simple narrative about class that if you take it literally, I mean, like 60% of the people in the workforce were secretly PMC, and like there would be some kind of industrial proletariat. That where is that exactly? I know Jacobin wrote a couple of articles this week trying to will it into existence again, but if you look at the numbers, the percentage in America is about 7% of industrial proletarian and likely to decline, despite the fact that manufacturing has been coming back to the United States over the past 2 decades. What has happened is most of that manufacturing is automated. So it's one of these things where because of my paleoconservative background, I hear a lot of left talking points that sound like degenerations in the paleoconservatism. The other big tell is how nationalist you think you are without realizing it.
Well, you mentioned earlier about being like a right-wing leftist. And I've heard people argue that's basically what the Soviets became, or what Stalinism represents, is right-wing leftism. What do you think about that? Like, when you see the left going for
right wing on what vector? Like, so I have been saying since 2016, after 10 years of watching the left, that I was afraid that methodological nationalism had infected the entire spectrum of the left, from the farthest left to the Social Democrats. And so that both Angela Nagel thought and Stalinist thought would become more popular because people wanted a methodological unit of collectivity, and the state seems like the obvious form. Now, what's hilarious about this is these people are, even if they're mass, are so far away from anything like the kind of power they would need to even approach that this is basically fantasy projection of lack of power. But it's something that I was actually predicting was going to happen very early on. And I felt that way because I started hearing talking points that reminded me of the talking points that convinced me 15 years ago to move into right-wing politics. And I've been kind of a crusader against some of this stuff. I'm not one of these red-brown conspiracy theorists who probably works for the State Department. People don't freak out. But I am one of those people who knows that when conservatives start to see a natural decline of their base and ideology, and right now they are, all right?
Yeah.
like the general, when I talk about the general counter-revolution, I kind of think all positions in the United States right now are dominant reactionary in temperament. And I can talk about what I mean by that later. But they're all defensive and all responsive to another side, and that's what's defining them. They are being defined by their reaction to their opposition, not to their positive politics. Which is a reactionary mode in my mind, temperamentally. It's now I separate between temperamental politics and substantive politics. And like temperamentally, for example, I'm kind of an egalitarian, so that puts me on the left. But like if you look at like Jonathan Haidt's scale, and there's lots of criticism of it, and I have my own. But he has the care, harm, fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal, authority, subversion, and sanctity, degeneration, and values for politics. Those are temperamental values. Those are not substantive values. Liberals and most leftists supposedly score high on care, harm, fairness, cheating, loyalty, betrayal. Conservatives score high on all five. I took the test about even after I was a Marxist for a long time. I took it out in 2012, so I had considered myself a formal Marxist for about 5 years at that point. And I showed up temperamentally bizarre. So I had all the values of liberals and leftists, but I also had super high values on authority and subversion, but idiosyncratic definitions of what constituted authority, and no real response to sanctity degradation. So I don't really have a disgust factor, which is something that aligns to most conservatives. Yes, I think that would not change throughout my life, that my basic temperament, because of I don't think it's genetic like Haidt does. I think there's a bunch of factors, including your social class, your region, what the primary, even down to like what the primary industries are in your area and their relationship to stability. I think that all has an effect on this temperament stuff, particularly as what you're exposed to in childhood. That's why like region more than class is actually a predictor of temperament, whereas actual and you can predict people's conservative or liberal temperament based on their region, which is a proxy for a bunch of other factors. What you actually know, however, is their voting patterns are often more determined by their social class. And so, for example, if you look at the voting patterns in the last two elections, Sunbelt rich and petite bourgeois tend to vote Republican. Rich, elite, and the poor, if they vote, tend to vote Democratic. Most working class people, regardless of their race, don't vote.
But what do you think about the last election? Like, I do want to get your take on the last election. We had like one of the most votingist. Wasn't it something like 60% of the voting population voted? Yeah, and it was 51 for Biden. And I'm like a good chunk into, it's actually for free on YouTube, the audiobook. I can't remember his name, but The Authoritarians, like he's the social scientist who, broke down what it means to be a right-wing authoritarian. Like that for me, I've always been anti-authoritarian. That's a big part of my leftism. I'm a socialist, but at the same time, I like listening to anarchists and I don't want to call myself a fence sitter, but I'm kind of open to, a lot of different things and change and all that. But one thing I've always recognized is that the right is not my friend. And some of the things are like, you've talked about, like growing up in an area that had diversity, having Black neighbors, having Latino classmates.
Yeah. You know that diversity and voting for anti-racist politics are negatively correlated, right?
Of course.
That's true. Course. That's actually true. And it's something that like liberals just lie about, just outright lie about. Like the places with a lot of the most symbolically anti-racist politics are some of the whitest areas in the country. And it's been something, those were the kinds of things, by the way, that the paleo conservatives would tell me that my leftist and liberal friends had no answer for. They would say stuff, okay, like, then why did the second Great Migration happen when everybody moved back to the South? in the 90s. Why is it that the more diverse an area it is, particularly if it's not particularly rich, the more conservative it is? And these things are actually sociological realities. They're more complicated than the way the paleoconservatives present them. In fact, the paleoconservatives are kind of lying about implications of them. But the left that I knew didn't even acknowledge the facts on the ground. And that's still true in a lot of ways. And so like coming out of the world I come out at, for me, it's always, I have to be very careful because a lot of people used to think that my sympathies were post-leftist because of my critiques of a lot of this stuff. They've never been, and I've had to be a lot more obvious about what I mean about certain things because of their misunderstandings of things that I've said. It's been one of the things that I've been sort of fascinated by in the way that the U.S. self-conceptualizes, because I would say that right now all the major ideological streams, not only are they reactionary, they're largely niche delusional. And by that, I mean they don't really know what people on the other worldview really thinks, because they're caught up in, and this I'm going to sound like a centrist Vox person, but they're caught up in basically discourses that are disconnected from any sense of organic community, so they don't know how to interact with people who are not just of their social class or racial background, but really of their micro niche, almost their political fandom.
I absolutely, and that's. I mean, that explains so much of the intra-left, the podcast wars is what I'm going to refer to, the early podcaster wars, the early 2021. But as
a person who's been left podcasting since 2011, I found so much of that shit ridiculous. But
well, me too. It's just childish and it's ego shit, and it's really weird. But I don't want to get derailed by it. But just I guess this idea that. Not only what you're talking about, people have their weird little niche, oh, do you listen to PodSafe? Oh, do you listen to whatever we watch, the Majority Report, or do you watch the Zero Books or whatever it might be? The right has done this. The right has burrowed down all their.
They've been doing it for longer, but we just started when I started in political podcasting in 2011, most of political podcasts were libertarian or right wing. That's just that was the fact, and that changed. But it's changed in a way that has worried me, because I think the left that kind of fought and emerged its way out of Occupy, got into the DSA, but we have become, definitely in the case of Corbyn and probably in the case of Bernie, if we are honest, we were unable to get out of our own heads and really think about what other people thought. And unfortunately, a lot of left media, and I don't just mean podcasts, I even mean the big magazines, they subsist by telling you what you want to believe.
Yeah.
That's how they subsist. We were talking about, I was talking with my friend J.M. Cologne over at my show, from the Libertarian Socialist Caucus. We have many disagreements. He probably thinks I'm authoritarian, but which is funny. But
you do joke around about shooting people a lot, Varn.
Well, yeah, but that's, you can freely shoot people. I don't want the government to do it. I'd rather, never mind. I'm not going to finish.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Jeez. Privatized. But man, what I guess the other thing I was thinking about was that we do this with the other side, where we turn it into a paper dragon. Or not that, but we overestimate what the other side.
Well, yeah, this is one thing I would say. Aside from Charlottesville, which was a real threat, I remember laughing at the idea that the alt-right was going to take over America through a Trumpist presidency and install a dictatorship. And I remember, and people have forgotten this, that people also thought this at the end of the Bush administration. Naomi Wolf, for whatever weirdness is she's pushing now, in 2008 wrote a book basically saying that Bush was going to coup Barack Obama and that we would never see democratic rule legitimately. And I actually I don't think it was remotely going to happen, but under the context of the Patriot Act, it's actually more reasonable than what we see now.
This is a weird thing that the discussion about Trump is very often when people want to say Trump was really, really bad, and absolutely he was. Like, he was exceptionally bad in an exceptional way, but like contextually, I remember Bush much differently. I mean, I guess it's the culture of amnesia, and everybody's quick just to forget how bad it really was. But I remember like George Carlin, like unironically calling Bush fascist on like Bill Maher back in the day, right? Like, there was a discourse about what Bush was doing that just because he's better at being crypto about it, and he's more of an empty suit, and like you said, just kind of puts the thing in his jaw there, keeps his jaw stiff, and now he's a guy you can have a beer with. Like, the issue was Obama came in and he didn't turn any of the dials down on any of that authoritarian shit. And then it was all ready for Trump. I didn't think Trump would install a dictatorship. I think maybe he would like to. I didn't think he would, but I do feel like you talked about Charlottesville. I also look at, the El Paso shooting, the Walmart El Paso shooting, the MAGA
worse
bomber.
In the 90s. Just want to point that out. As an objective fact, it was worse in the 90s.
No joke. Oklahoma City, Columbine was done. The Columbine killers weren't mad at the jocks, everybody. That's fake news, right? They were, reading the Turner Diaries and doing it on the anniversary of Oklahoma City. But like, if the left, because it also reminds me of like the Daily Show at that time was like the only left identity that people had, and it was completely reactionary liberal, like the rally to restore sanity, whatever, like embarrassing shit that was, right? So when like is the left, do you see the left now, and whichever section you want to appraise them all one after the other, do you feel like the left now understands what it's working against with the right?
No. Absolutely not.
Tell us why, and what does the left need to know about the right, especially right now?
One is that the right is not unified. It has never been unified. The idea that it's unified is kind of a myth that the left tells itself to explain its own fuck-ups. Because there is a way in which they're more clearly able to rally around a singular Bonapartist figure than the left is able to do. But it is also because it also misses. For example, I've been pushing back on people who told me about profound dangers of Trumpism. In fact, that I had strong words on air for John Michael Colon about this, where he was like, we had the take of a fascist takeover, and I was like, maybe post-fascist, no real threat, incoherent. Trump isn't an ideologue, and if he actually was, he wouldn't want. Like, yes, QAnon is a weird fascist movement, but it's a fascist movement in a way that we don't even know how to deal with because it doesn't actually resemble like the alt-right. The alt-right was super limited, and people's fears of them was always exaggerated. I knew who Richard Spencer was when I was a paleo conservative. I've told this story several times.
I've heard it, yeah.
And
he was editor of National Review?
Well, was one of the assistant arts editors, not the editor. He's one of the assistant arts editors of the paleo conservative magazine, American Conservative. He was a student of Paul Gottfried, who was a student of Herbert Marcuse, which is an interesting line that we can go into.
Yeah,
a lot of the post-Frankfurt School people around Teleos magazine and around somebody called Paul Picone in the 90s went all right-wing, and they were even like importing European New Right, which is quasi-fascist stuff, into American left literature in the late 90s, early aughts. So it was this movement. I took the alt-right to be a more serious threat because I figured they could actually renormalize themselves into national conservatism in a way, and actually maybe even attract former disenfranchised leftists, which I had seen happen a lot in my circle. So I have known one of the things that's hurt me as a person who came from the right to the left is I've watched a lot of people around me I've watched more people around me make the opposite journey as they got old and scared than I've seen the other way around. So, like, I was writing a book with the infamous Michael Rettenwald, who, you know, I was writing a book with him on laicism, which I had to scrap because he lost his damn mind. And I mean, I shouldn't say that because he's litigious, but like he got really mad at elements of the liberal left and started defining himself in opposition to it. And then all of a sudden, he was taking up purely conservative talking points. He wasn't the only person in my life that had done that. Like I had known some people who have been around Kasama Project, actually, not as members, but as fellow travelers who became like left Trumpist. They really were a thing. I had known.
What about the pro-Trump accelerationists? That was a thing too.
Yeah, those are a little bit harder to deal with because they still believe that they're still in the mainstay part of the left, as opposed to some of these post-left or anti-left people who don't. But a lot of the post-left stuff, which has been developing since Bernie, I saw a lot of the precursors for in these people that I'm talking about. But this was around the early Trump administration. They believed the Steve Bannon rhetoric, and I remember laughing at them. And Tom O'Brien from Alpha to Omega and I had a debate where he was like, "Well, what if Trump does nationalist MMT and like has like a right-wing progressivism?" And I just laughed and I said, it's not going to happen because he doesn't have the Republican support, and it's incoherent. Like it wouldn't work. Like it's not. It doesn't actually economically make sense.
Yeah, that gets into the whole idea of right populism. Does it even exist? And that's for me because I remember like I was addicted to Gawker, like that when it was like at its height, and they were on the Bannon beat early. So it's like I knew quite well who Bannon was and what he represented, and I was reading about the Mercers, and that's why like when Trump won the nomination, like I got real fucking uncomfortable like that because and when Hillary won the Democratic nomination, that's when I got super uncomfortable because I was like, oh shit, this could happen. And I guess for me the like one of the few monikers that I do put on myself politically, other than being leftist and some type of socialist, is anti-authoritarian. I don't like authoritarianism, whether it's left or right. You know, put the dem and dem sock, I guess, for me. But like I recognize that Trump, even if he didn't become a fascist dictator, like you said, ideologically incoherent, I identify physically lazy, intellectually, not there at all. Like, you know what I mean? Like he's probably one of the most reactionary people. You know what I mean? Like reactionary in like
he's reactionary in the way
a mollusk would be.
Well, let me talk about this a little bit because Pascal Robert from This Is Revolution came onto this for similar reasons. So there's a difference between the people who are related to the founders of the country and that bourgeoisie and the blatant upperly mobile nouveau riche bourgeoisie that replaces them. And if you want a story about this, read Faulkner. Faulkner's Compton's versus Snopes portrays this very well. And I hate to make this about literature, but it actually is one of the best portrayals in literature about this, where the old aristocrats, they were slavers, they were awful.
Yeah.
But the people replacing them had no loyalty to anything. And
new money. Yeah.
Right. And no organic relationship to the founding of the country. One of the things that I point this out because it makes me sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's literally true. Like most of our presidents, not all of them, but most of our presidents come from the aristocratic family lines of the New England bourgeoisie. That's where they come from. They're old money.
Yep.
Including even the white half of Obama's family. All right. Like this is an objective fact. So the exceptions to that have been Jimmy Carter, Eisenhower, who came up through the military, Grant, who came up through the military, and Lincoln. But there's not many. Trump is another exception. Trump does not have any organic relationship to that group of people. He's new money, sketch money, dirty money. And what I think a lot of the reason why the reaction for him from liberals was so strong was not what he was doing, but what he represented to a certain coterie of the United States, which was the end of this rule that has an organic, literal relationship going back to the foundation of the bourgeoisie of this country. So they're not necessarily the founders, but the people who established the first businesses. Some of them go back that far. Some of them go back to the early 18th century, but they're kind of our aristocracy. They're the aristocratic bourgeoisie, the hot bourgeoisie, the people whose credentials actually in the national currency have been dropping for the last 3 decades, but they've still dominated politics. That's ended. That's over. You
think so because of Trump?
Well, also, I mean, Biden's not really tied into that. Obama was less tied into that because of his race and his immigrant ancestry. Kamala Harris is elite, but elite from another country. As far like, which is also tripping up our own discourse problems in the United States with like ADOS and I pointed out that why I think ADOS is probably going to end up being a reactionary movement. Their claim that the wealth disparity of slavery has never been addressed in black politics because a lot of the black leadership as immigrant are multiracial and thus not subject to the same generational deprivation is true. What I find interesting is that that's also true for a lot of white people. That's also true for that's true for almost every indigenous person. That's true for certain kinds of immigrants over other kinds of immigrants. And actually, some of that even comes from America's racist policies. So, for example, Nigerians and Southeast Asians and South Asians are the richest minority groups in the United States on aggregate, right? Do you know why? Those are the countries that it's the hardest to get into the United States with. It's almost impossible if you don't have refugee status to come from Africa to the United States. So the people who come are the mega rich of Africa. So
they have money.
And so ironically, it leads to this situation where we have a disrepresentative super rich amongst the hyper oppressed minority group, but also the only reason that's the case is our own racist policies of immigration. And so the ADOS movement has a point about this. I think their answer totally destroys solidarity, even amongst people of color, much less the working class, and thus would probably end up being a reactionary movement. But their initial problem that they point out is completely true. I agree with Pascal Robert that the way you handle it is just getting rid of the wealth disparity meaning anything. Like, that's how you fix it. Any attempt to do transfers from one group to the other will cause further backlashes, even within my minority in quotation marks groups. So this is something that we have to deal with as leftists, but it's something that we have to look at in our contemporary politics, because right now we've had 2 national leaders of color who've made it to the executive office in the highest orders, neither one of whom have any descendant of slave ancestry. But Trump is kind of this weird proof of the degeneration of our original bourgeoisie. They can't even control politics anymore. They haven't been able to control the viable economic situation for a long time. That's why you've seen these mega rich rags to riches stories becoming more and more common. Yeah. So it's a very interesting predicament that we currently find ourselves in. The left doesn't understand how this is actually really divided up the right. Like, they don't understand. They just mock the claims of QAnon, whereas QAnon is the right-wing paranoid version of a lot of the stuff the far left actually says, but it's been literalized.
No, that's what trips me out, is how much this discourse mirrors stuff. Shit I used to hear, like I kind of, with 9/11 happening when we were young, it was kind of inescapable, the conspiracy theory and the saturation of like, that's what they want you to think. And you know what I mean?
And we forget that leftists were the predominant, left liberals were the predominant conspiracy theorists of that era.
And it's interesting. See, and this, like, in this discussion we're having about left and right, I remember being young and like discovering my politics. Had a friend, his dad was like, was the one driving us to these anti-war protests. Was very much like considered himself having left politics and being against the American war machine and against this. But the guy's like full blown into like water fluoride in the water conspiracy theories. Later gets caught up in all these, whatever, pick whichever one you want over the years. But it's like I recognize that once you go far enough left, there's a weird blurring that happens where all of a sudden, like, these right-wing talking points or these just weird conspiracies, like you said, like the left had conspiracy. I'm wondering how many people have been caught up because of the whole, now that it's so amalgamated with the lifestyle movement, yoga moms and all this shit that are QAnon people. Like, I know of like hairdressers that are anti-vax and are telling people, on social media, and they have a lot of pull there, not to get vaccinated and this kind of shit. I'm wondering how many of those people were some kind of disaffected lefty during the Bush years. I mean, I still remember when Trump was like shitting on Bush during the debates, and like you saw the Republican reaction on like Twitter, just like going after each other. You know what I mean? And like, do you see it as a good thing, this conservative split? And I'm definitely one who's tried to tell people for a long time, don't like monolith conservatives or the right, because they're not the same. You could sometimes colloquially like country club Republicans and not so even though Trump owns country clubs, you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, but it's old money versus new money. I mean, Trump's country clubs are gold, and the old money knows better than to do that. Like, and I mean, literally, go to Vegas, you can see this outright.
Yeah, that's funny.
But my issue is that I think you're right, but I think what it means is actually very bad for the left right now, because the left itself, frankly, is deluded about its own power. It has never in the United States been in the kind of power that it thinks it's in. And it's had so little power for so long that having any mass force even equal to what was like the early period of late 60s and 70s, which is really what the analogous time period is. This is not like the 20s where there was a real left electoral force. Like the DSA is larger than the SDS, but that's what it's analogous to. And it's only, and when I say it's larger than the SDS, it's only larger than the SDS by like 20,000 people.
Okay.
And if you adjust for population, the SDS would be about the same size.
Okay.
So for those of you who don't know, that's the Students for the Democratic Society. Those are the big people who protest. It started by a libertarian, became dominated by socialists and leftists, eventually became dominated by the RCP and Stalinists, and that led to it eventually folding. Because it really was infiltrated by various sectarian groups, and then they were able to, that got a lot of COINTELPRO heat on it, in addition to everything that, in addition to the infighting that immediately occurred when you have dim-sit sectarian groups operating in a multi-tendency, and not even multi-tendency, like multi-ideology coalition in the case of the SDS, because it wasn't even necessarily all socialist. That's what we have right now. We have a bigger breakdown and a bigger crisis than before. But as I've told people, when people were laughing at me 2 years ago, and I was like, look, QAnon's a joke, but there are more QAnon people by an order of magnitude than there are DSAers. And they're more evenly spread out throughout the country. The DSAers are in very specific regions. They tend to be the slightly more affluent working class, which is a weird thing to say, but it's like the last few demographics even proved this. Like, they're slightly better off than most of the working class, but only slightly. But they live in rich areas. And so they have that kind of lifestyle concerns. Now, there are plenty of working class. This is where like I really deviate from the post left. Like, there are plenty of working class trans, queer people. There are plenty of working class, but of course there's plenty of working class people. It's like it's half of the working class, if not more now, and it's going to be even more in the near future, just because so much of the white working class is so old. But so definitely that. And the DSA is diverse, but its leadership is actually deceptive. Like if people were in the DSA know it operates with quotas for progressive reasons. I don't necessarily agree with that. Then I can talk about why, but it does. And so the leadership is always more diverse than the actual membership. So I think the membership is like 60% 70% white or something like that. It's a lot. It's more than the country. So, and this opens a lot of socialists up to a lot of the accusations that, paleo conservatives would throw at them. Whereas a lot of the QAnon people really are poor, really are, even from our cultural notion, working class. A lot of them are petit bourgeois too.
That's my experience with them, is that they.
So it's a weird coalition of petit bourgeois who tend to be the leadership, and then occasionally working class people who get sucked into it out of desperation. And I also think it's going to be increasingly people of color. That's the trend that I see happening.
That's interesting, and it ports into people's it ports into people's different like feelings and beliefs. Like I know people who were attracted to that stuff because of the anti-vax kind of attitudes. The people who hate Gavin Newsom here in California.
Like what demographic group has the largest anti-vax attitudes in the United States?
That would be white women, white people.
No,
am I wrong? Oh,
you're
okay.
wrong.
Well, yeah. Okay. Then tell me. I
think it is actually it's poor black people, directly correlated. And here's what I even say to that. They have legit reasons to be paranoid about it.
Damn right.
They Henrietta Lacks, Tuskegee experiment, everything that we've been like covering up about the middle of the 20th century, I wouldn't trust us either. There's a cop. Yeah. Like I've been hearing people have been like, why do people not trust American institutions anymore? I'm like, I don't know. We know what you did for the last 100 years.
Exactly.
So this is where I get like, there's a working class hesitancy towards a vaccine that I think is counterproductive and damaging, is going to lead to a lot of unnecessary working class death, but is immediately not as irrational as we think. Right. And then the next largest group is conservatives, but a lot of conservatives are actually giving that up. And it's beginning the trail of like opposition from healthcare workers and stuff is starting to kick up. And the other thing that hasn't helped, and this hasn't been discussed enough, is I'm going to be honest, liberals have oversold the efficacy of the vaccine. And that's not helping. Just like when Fauci and stuff in the beginning of the pandemic shot on masks because they were kind of afraid that people would make a run on N95s.
Yeah. And just like they said, oh, you're vaccinated, no mask is fine, when they really didn't have the data on that shit. They didn't fucking know.
Right. And so but as time goes on, there's more and more breakthrough cases. And then some places, like, it does look really bad. And of course, anti-vaxxers are seizing on that shit really fast. Where I'm like, it's very new technology. It does actually seem to work, but we didn't really have the data, and people were over-promising.
Yeah. Yeah, they were.
And this has been my problem right now about what we don't understand about ourselves, even on the left, is a weird kind of way that we have actually started to defend the status quo because of the people who attack it, and because the people who attack it are clearly irrational, but not looking at the fact that, like, I think this is what I was talking about with QAnon woo, though. I think we're going to see a lot more of it in communities that are really paranoid about the vaccine. And as it moves away from explicit relationship to Trumpism. I also think, by the way, this situation in Afghanistan that we see today is going to lead to a backlash, but everyone thinks it's going to lead to a Trumpist backlash, and I don't, because Biden's policy is essentially identical to Trump's.
His foreign
Biden
policy
just did it. His pullout policy was what Trump was promising to do and didn't.
Exactly.
Right?
So what do you think the reactionary impulse against Afghanistan
I think like all these sleeper neoconservatives are going to find their way back into coalitions. Like, I'm unsure if they're going to team up with the national conservatives who have kind of the intellectual wing of the Trumpist movement, or if they're going to hook up with all these Democrats who are going after Biden now the CNN, MSNBC people who've turned on Biden so strongly, and particularly after this suicide bombing.
Yeah.
But you know what? I mean, I've been warning people. A lot of the left, Tuck Inwood. I don't normally shot fires at individuals, but I'm going to have to on this one. A lot of the left has been really sanguine on Biden off of very little evidence because of rhetoric in the beginning of the administration and because of a few kind of progressive things that we didn't expect snuck into the to the initial draft of the infrastructure bill and to the COVID bills. But it was because we didn't expect anything. It's because our imagination got slow, and like basic stuff really isn't on the table. Like, despite the fact we have a worldwide pandemic, we are further away from Medicare for all than we probably were. Student loan forgiveness. We can't even get people to talk about the remission of student loan interest. Like, okay, which would be massive. I mean, it's nothing. No, but I will say this, and I see this as a left communist who basically believes like none of this under, like my basic belief is until you get rid of capitalism, hook, line, and sinker everywhere, that this will always be a problem, and you can't totally reform yourself away from it. I will also say that as a practical person who comes out of people with real needs, I'm not an idiot. I'm not going to oppose Medicare for all if we were to get it, and I'm not going to oppose even like minor remediations of student debt off of some anti-PMC binge that some dumbass who doesn't understand statistics throws at you, or relative wealth, or anything like that. So I will say that while I worry that so much of our platform in the last 4 years of socialism has been that minuscule, it also has worried me that we haven't seen even the ability to call for things that might actually get through the Senate to happen as immediate, like intermediate steps. Because one of the things that I've been interested in is I've been sold by social democrats, not to get into inner left disputes, that we need like intermediate steps, but then they get all absolutist on a minimal program. Like, I'm just like, well, if you're going to be absolutist or don't be. Like, I'm not even hearing for them to call in for like the end of student interest, which could be done immediately at almost no cost to anyone. It's all based on future progressions. So it's it's a
good point. Well, so I mean, is it a lack of imagination? You know, like everybody, like we're a lot of the left YouTubers, because we're satisfying or self-fueling, will say that like, oh, we'll talk endlessly about the Overton window.
Fuck the Overton window.
Like how do you see the Bernie's bill, basically the reconciliation bill, like expansion of Social Security? It's a pittance. It doesn't fucking the free community college. Who gives a shit?
I don't think.
Wait, real quick. I heard you say. I think I heard you say on a podcast, pragmatism sounds like Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah,
like that.
Well, okay, so I will say this because I have progressive people on the right end of the DSA tell me that like with Bernie in his position, we'll be able to sneak all this stuff through reconciliation. We might get some stuff through reconciliation on the infrastructure bill. We might. Free community college would be. It's actually kind of minimal. For one, it's going to devalue community college. For another, I highly doubt they're going to invest enough in it to matter. Although, I mean, if you look at what we spend on wars, we totally could. We could have, hell, I think 2 years of the war could pay for every college in the United States and most past debt. But this is what we're not looking at. Our currency is buoyed up by military power as much as it is any raw commodity. And this is the global fiat currency thing that one of your commenters mentioned about an hour ago. It's related to that. It's kind of like the dark. I keep on, when I get in an argument about modern monetary theorists, I'm like, well, can you do this without the military hegemony to force people to use your currency on the international market to get the pieces that you need from outside of your country? Because no country can operate as an economic autarky which is totally subsistent within itself. Nobody has all the resources to do that in a modern economy. No country does. Not China, not the United States, not Canada, no one. So like the United States, China, India, Canada, the Eurozone altogether, they can operate with relative autonomy. They can produce a lot of their own stuff. We really don't need as much as we import, particularly in the United States, but we can't do all of it. There's no way. So this is something that you have to actually look at and the way to deal with things in the future. And by the way, while I don't think the American empire is going to fall overnight just because of what happened in Afghanistan, I think that's a ludicrous hope. I will say that we really do live in a multipolar world now, which is why we're not going to see a lot of like Bidenist adventurism in the Middle East or in Asia, obviously, because China is a regional influencer. And all this Cold War stuff is kind of almost, it's kind of a false gambit to try to shore up a regional, area of influence that's larger than we would naturally have. It's also why, for example, Latin American leftist countries will never see China or Russia as real threats to them. I think when Morales was talking about that, and he was like, well, they're just doing their own thing. Of course, it's not imperial. I think that's not entirely true, but I think from Morales' perspective, he's absolutely right, because his threat is us and will be us, because even if we were no longer the global hegemon, we don't need to be the mess with Latin America. We've been doing that since we had sticks.
Yeah.
So like, since we figured out that we had cannons and they kind of didn't have as many of them, we've been messing with Latin America. So like, it's just like, filibustering the Mexican-American War, the Monroe Doctrine itself, which sounds anti-imperialism. It is anti-imperialist towards Europe, but it's totally imperialist towards ourselves.
Absolutely.
So like, it's like, we can be imperialist here and you can't, is what it's saying. And if you try to overthrow these governments, we'll reinstall them, because screw you, but they're going to be our puppet governments when we do so. And so like, that's the Latin American left's concerns. I think this is one of the things that I rejected way back in my paleoconservative days. I think, for example, I remember people defending Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who is basically, in my mind, the Iranian version of George Bush, because of alliances with Hugo Chavez's Venezuela, which I did think was, I thought Venezuela during over periods of Chavismo was totally defensible. One of the ironies that paleoconservatives will often point out, however, is that leftists tend to double down on defending these, quote, left nations when they actually liberalize their own economies. So when they do...
Sorry, we got a comment here. I don't mean to interrupt what you're saying.
No, yeah. It's in all sorts, particularly Europe. That's also the truth behind the quotes that like European social democracy is dependent on imperialism. A lot of that's actually true. We have secured their trade routes for them. We have done their security for them. That's what NATO does. We didn't do it out of the kindness of our hearts. Like, don't start getting that. We did it to dominate a kind of an international quasi-polity of trade, where we set the rules up after the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan. Yeah.
The Marshall Plan plus the Monroe Doctrine create some really nasty things, because what we do is we would outsource our excess production to Europe, which actually helps our economy. And rebuild theirs, while when we did extractive stuff, we did it in the sphere of our influence, which is Latin America and to some degree Africa. So it's very much a real politique problem. And yes, the commenter is right that the reason why people have let us do this is because they don't have the expense of maintaining the global trade system, of which they benefit from. And there's a real sense that a lot of European social democracy, while more stable than American capitalism and more efficient in a lot of ways, is still dependent on American dysfunction. It might be able to pivot to China for a lot of what it needs, actually, but it's hard to see in the long run. Like, one of the things, for example, when you see these balance of trade things, when you talk about, oh, well, China is getting more of the global trade than the United States. The Eurozone is producing more, but doesn't have more raw GDP. But what you're not really looking at is all these zones are totally dependent on each other to even finish up their products.
Mm-hmm.
Like, capitalism is a fucking global system in which all these nodes are, and guys, wake up. China's part of the core now. Like, it's new, but you can't be the most productive, about to have the most raw GDP, despite the fact that your GDP ratios are declining, which is predictable.
Mm-hmm.
But and not be part of the core. Like, wake up to this reality. And so one of the things that I was going to tell you, one of the things that the left is not right about the right, is the left doesn't see its own nostalgia, like, and its own inability to look at the objective facts. It just projects that onto the right. Well, the right, yeah, a lot of the, like, QAnon people, they're nuts. They're literalizing conspiracy theories about the things we're describing in a very, like, they're pedophile vampires who's, yeah. I mean, literally, but
yeah. But
I've
been hearing people on the left say vampires for years. Talking about economic vampires.
We just didn't believe it literally. Like,
yeah, we didn't know they would take it and really run with that shit like that. Oh my god! Or calling it satanic, calling weapons manufacturers satanic is another thing. They think there's real blood ritual.
Okay. So as a last thing that I'll say on this, how I got out of conservatism. But one thing I say against leftists, I believe in personal virtue and that you cannot be a moral nihilist, but I also believe you cannot frame your politics in terms of morality, which is weird, because what I'm not telling you can't have your morality inform your politics, but you cannot think that your rhetorical appeals based on morality are what's going to win out for people politically, because people don't necessarily share your values, even if they're of your same class. And that's something we have to address. That's Marxists were very good on this in the past historically, actually. Like, it's like, we could talk about objective interest, sectional interest, united interest, reasons for solidarity. We can talk about the morality of solidarity. We might even talk about what bourgeois morality might look like versus proletarian morality. But what we cannot say is that our appeals to politics are absolutely based on a moral appeal. Conversely, there's another thing that Marxists do that kind of bugs me, is they pretend that, like, the problems with exploitation is completely objective and, like, there's no moral component there, which I think is kind of like, well, if you don't believe exploitation is wrong, then, like, you can totally actually adopt capitalism.
Yeah. Why be a Marxist if not otherwise? That's the thing, is, like, this is why I started my channel, is because I do believe that people, because I know do get convinced by arguments, by discussions, by people making a case for something, right? And actually getting into the dialectics of it, because that's how I pulled myself out of reactionary bullshit, was just by hearing people challenging it and making sense of it. We all try to do it for ourselves, but what do you think, if you were to, for you, what does the left need to be doing? We've deconstructed, like, how the left doesn't understand the right. The moral arguments don't work. The I don't know what you think about ridicule and making fun of people, how much that helps. But what do you think?
I think it can help with the individual. I think it absolutely fails with groups. But anyway, like.
But what do you think the left? If we want the left to become less of the, like you said, a reactionary force without positive politics, if we want the left to grow in any real kind of way in this country, I think that doesn't forsake pulling people out of the right. Like, how do you do it? Like, how like, part of why I like listening to you and your show and how you see things is that, I'm definitely not as left as you, so I guess that makes me to the right of you, but, like, you're
From my
pulling me.
perspective, you are.
Exactly. You're pulling me that way. But when I listen to the way you make arguments, and I know you can be bookish like you and break down the history and you know, get in, and that helps a lot of people when you put the labels on it and use them responsibly and all that. But like for the normies, like how do you think the left can be more than just a subculture, or these fractal subcultures online that are warring with each other?
One thing is you really do have to actually organize, but that I'm almost hesitant to use the word because it's thrown around so much it almost doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
I'm not really a hardline Leninist, so people don't freak out when I say this. But Lenin did have a motto that you had to understand all the social classes, try to interact, and be able to move between them and know what they actually believe.
Mm-hmm.
That we have to do, and that's not easy. Like, I will say that I didn't really understand the true bourgeoisie until I worked abroad and worked for them in a very real way. I had never been exposed to the really rich. I remember when I was younger, I went to college and I was talking about rich people in North Atlanta, and my friend who's like friends with like Czesław Miłosz, like the Polish poet, was like, they aren't rich. You don't know rich.
Yeah.
And when I worked at private elite schools in Egypt, where I taught people who could afford more than a year's average salary to send their kid to an international school, and they paid it in U.S. cash in a place where it was hard to get reserve currency.
Damn. Yeah.
I realized I started really seeing who the rich and the global rich really were, and that I really didn't know who they were. And their values were kind of different than everybody's. And their kids actually, in some ways, had some of the problems I was used to the very poor having, as opposed to. But it was it was a wake up call for me. So the left needs to actually get out of its milieu, and it's very hard to do during COVID. This is one thing I will say: almost everything we need to do for a left is complicated by COVID in a very real way. Like, not just about the discourse around COVID, because like diseases are not times to try to organize massive positive politics. You can do resistance politics during those times because you're in crisis mode. So like, you know, you can riot. You can riot.
That's what I was wondering.
I'm not gonna
like,
say that's nothing, but
is it reactionary in its own way though? Like, did the pandemic create a reactionary turn even on the left?
Well, yeah. But the rioting, I don't see the rioting as reactionary so much as a sign of inability to do much. I would say
Biden is more reactionary.
Right. Like, I think like there are people on the left, the communization theorists, who are all in the riot porn. I do not think riots are necessarily negative things. Mm-hmm. I'm not against riots. I'm kind of against street protest, actually, but I'm not against riots.
But wasn't it something to see, like, because we know Nixon like won the White House preaching law and order after 1968, right? But like now you have we had Trump preaching law and order when it was under his own leadership, right? The country is just completely going to shit.
And he was also like it was transparent to even the military and to normies that he was actually reinciting some of the the riots in places where they had largely died down and were very removed from the initial thing. I mean, one of the things that I've told people, look at the patterns of the way this moves out. They tend to start in like highly minority, highly working class, Midwest industrial Rust Belt burned out cities like St. Louis, Minneapolis, maybe parts of Chicago, Detroit. And then they die in places where there are actually working class people. This is a myth that there isn't, but they're way more white, way more affluent. It's the poor people in the affluent areas, and then like the middle people beginning to side with them off of their plight. You know, and I use this because we have to have multiple conceptions of class when we talk about this too. The left needs to like be able to think about class in multivariate ways. That's another thing we need to change. Like, just talking about some generic working class is useless. most people in the United States, like 80% of the population, is part of what you could see as the proletariat, or at least the working class, depending on the wage fund, if not the proletariat. That's not very helpful for people's actual experience of class. That's not very helpful for people's sectional interest. That's extremely helpful to help them see how you would overcome this, because we really are a majority of people. But this facile populism of like Wall Street versus Main Street, of the 99% versus the 1%, and all that horse shit was never going to fly. It really never was, because people's experience of class is not that at all. It's just like their experience of race is usually more complicated and more multifarious and more hostile than they would like to admit, whether even if they're leftist a lot of the time.
It really is weird how it's almost like Russian dolls, where, I'm in California, or, whatever metaphor, but I'm in California, and someone could easily look at me and be like, oh, you fucking coastal elite lib, like, whatever.
Yeah, even though you're a working class former journalist, right?
Yeah,
but part of me does actually. There's a part of my core that used to be a paleo conservative that goes, you're in California, you're around rich people. Even if you're not rich, you get like tangible benefits for being near them.
But this is the other thing. I didn't learn my leftism on a college campus. You know what I mean? I grew up left and being, downwardly mobile, in a conservative area that was like always preaching this kind of like, you just need to work hard and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But it's like, well, how about all these indigenous farm workers? They work real fucking hard.
Right.
But it's like the millionaire landowner that's like a county supervisor that seems to be like doing the best out of it. But even then, within the regionalism of this area, I can drive 20 minutes or an hour, and then people are looking down their nose at me like, oh, I can't believe they're here. Oh, who let them in? You know what I mean? And so it's like, that's how I've experienced class too.
Right. So so let me talk about this maybe in a way that makes it the multivariant class thing. You're totally working class. I don't actually believe what I just said. However, what I will say, if you're from a region that actually does imperialize the rest of the, even internal to itself, and then shames the rest of the area about it, because it's like, well, you red states don't pay taxes, we give you stuff. Well, you extract our value, you extract our raw commodities, you extract our brain. Our better people go there. You sell it back to us at a price enough to make you the like one fifth of our entire economy, and you're kind of assholes. So like the rest of the country kind of hates California for reasons that you, as a working class California in this area, are subject to a completely different set of demographic concerns. We have to approach class multivariantly and still insist that you and I, even though I would say I'm a labor aristocrat because I work in a curtailed field, right? I'm a teacher. Teachers, people say we're PMC. We are socially necessary, non-productive. We're exploited by the state, but we don't produce a commodity. We're really weird. We're also highly cartelized. We're highly cartelized. It's hard to scab on us. It's really hard, which makes the dynamics of the way teachers' unions work and the way we can work very different than everybody else. However, we're super proletarianized in other ways. Like we're squeezed as much as they can squeeze us. Because while we're given these benefits by being cartelized, we're also limited in what we can do off of the fear of losing that cartelization, which is what the licensure effectively is. So you have to be able to think about these in multivariant, complicated ways. And I can tell you, if you read Jacobin magazine, you're not going to be able to fucking do that. Like that's like, it's not that Jacobin's that bad either. That's like better left reporting in a lot of ways. Like Jacobin publishes stuff that I like. I've also hated a lot of it, but like I'm not picking on it in particular.
Yeah.
All right. That's not my point. My point is we tend to tell ourselves jingoistic narratives. We tend to drink our own Kool-Aid. Now, people with actual power don't do that, at least in the first generation. Unfortunately, they tend to do it over time. But like Eisenhower didn't believe his shit about the Soviet Union. Like FDR probably really did. Truman maybe. But Eisenhower did not. But Jack Kennedy sure as hell did. All right. So what do we have to be? We cannot to ourselves try to convince ourselves with agitprop. And I also think we shouldn't try to do it to the general public either. We should be as honest as we can. So and be honest in ways that hurt a lot of our own arguments, I think, in a way, but would help it ultimately. Like when people want to fight ADOS, I gotta say, like, you know, there's a lot of people on the black left who want to fight ADOS. And I gotta say, like, you want to do that, you need to admit that there's a reality that they're responding to. Exactly. You want to deal with these conservative wackadoos? Well, ask yourself, why do they believe there's a global conspiracy elite that are literally raping and eating children? Because we kind of believe they're doing that metaphorically. We just didn't take the next step. Mm-hmm. And every now and then real stuff comes out that makes it look like, well, maybe there are pedophile cabals amongst the rich and they're getting away with all kinds of shit.
Yeah.
I mean, and also,
but this is the thing, like, and like you said, this is where the left is gets the thankless, dirty job. Mike Rowe could feature on his shitty show, Dirty Jobs, of defending liberals, right? Only because the right is so completely unhinged. You know, they're flooding school board with critical race theory panics and mask mandates. I mean, I have it going on in Trumpy areas.
If we were really serious, I don't think we'd be trying to defend liberals. I think we'd be flooding back. I mean that, like, literally. I think we, instead of focusing on national politics, which are kind of a way, which we're not anywhere near ready to do, you would actually be doing the organization on the ground, and probably not even for electoral campaigns at this point. And you know what? The right doesn't always waste their time with that shit. They know they actually are better adjudicators of their strategic resources than we are. I can tell you, because I've been over there, and I can also tell you they're better at cultivating their own talent than we are too. Like, why is every one of us in busker economies, even when we have access to, like, rich patrons, like,
that's something that I like. If we want to be cynical and we just want to be look at it as coldly as possible, that's something I've, like, said the left needs to study the arts of the enemy a bit. Because, like, I live within...
They studied, like, the arts of the enemy. That's how they did what they did. I mean, like...
Fucking A, right? Like, I live within... You talked about cultivating talent. I live within, like, an hour or two of Reagan Ranch. And that has become, like, this training ground for young conservatives. So, you know, that's why, like, you hear these very kind of, like, low information arguments, like, oh, term limits will help. It's like, do you, like, really you think so? Because the right will just have a conveyor belt constantly where they're like the next, you know, Matt Gaetz is
who's more geriatric in politics? It's the Democrats are all, like, over 80. Like, I realized that I made the mistake of watching the impeachment process, not because I, like, cared really, but
which one?
The second one. And I was watching these geriatric Democrats who literally people like Ted Cruz could dance around rhetorically, which was horrifying.
Yeah. Yep.
Because I'm like, you shouldn't be losing to... Yeah.
When Tom Cotton looks sharp, you got a problem.
Right. You shouldn't be losing to these ill-fitting Brute Brothers suits, motherfuckers.
Oh.
Like, you know, like, come on. And so, like, term limits, that would probably get rid of most of Democrats. I mean, this is where I think we have to cultivate our own talent. I think the turn against mutual aid is stupid, because mutual aid is not about, like, it is a form of charity effectively, but what it teaches you to do is how to organize your own resources when things fall apart. And it does build inroads in the communities that are otherwise hostile or at least negligent towards you.
Exactly. It builds solidarity.
You need those people. Another thing is we got to do is, while rural issues are a smaller and smaller part of the United States, and that's true, you do have to speak to it because they produce your food.
You can't, and I know that here, man. I know that here because there is left politics here in agriculture, in food production. Like the concentrated power of farm workers and people of color in this valley is union. It's union power.
Right. But we've let the union, we have not figured out how to unionize a lot of these areas outside of places that have been historically strong and also historically rich. The richer a place is, the less likely it is to have have scabbing, because people aren't as desperate, and that's just a fact.
Of course.
So it's like we have to look. Sometimes you do have to just be like, look at the incentives, look at your common sense. Like, so the left needs to do that. The left needs to get off the staff about theory too, and also quit. And it needs to quit having parasocial relationships with
video game streamers,
with video game streamers, but also with politicians. Like, you don't need a parasocial relationship with AOC.
Yeah,
AOC is not your constituent. You're not AOC's constituent unless you are, and in which case you should hold her more accountable. Like, and I'm also not saying that we should hate AOC. That whole thing is a distraction.
Exactly right. Exactly. I don't want to keep you all night, Varn, and I got to get going here pretty quick myself. But I think that what you're saying is very important. Like, so much of, like, I think what we see with the online left lately, especially, has been like a spinning of the wheels. Like, we're just, and I think a lot of it is just because Biden won, because it's Biden. You know what I mean? And, like, you know, Trump isn't
worse
driving.
Than that. I think it's. I mean, like, we're not actually as bad as, like, Corbyn. Like, the British left has totally fucking committed seppuku.
Yeah,
and I know a lot of them because when I was in Egypt, they were closer to me than the American left, and I've just seen it. Like, they just dead. But painful, so if you want to feel, there are places worse than the United States right now to be a leftist. But what I was gonna say is we have to look at a couple of imminent realities. We have to figure out how to organize care workers and service sector workers in a franchise environment. We have to deal with Taft-Hartley, and we have to deal with banking issues. Those are all real concerns. We also have to realize that a lot of left policies that are pitched as progressive, that would be progressive if they were fully implemented, are highly regressive when they're partially so. I'm not an enemy of MMT, but if all you're getting out of MMT is 0% bank loan interest rates, you're creating a rentier economy that favors people who already have capital, because they can get more stuff, to buy more stuff, to raise the rents up, and that will have more inflation. They don't have a problem with inflation, because inflation shrinks debt, and debt patronage is a major problem for the middle of the working class. But if you're in the very low end of the working class, you're completely screwed by inflation. So, like, you have to deal with this in a more realistic way. And so that's what I would tell people is study this stuff. And, like, I know Marxist theory. I do. Like, I can quote Marxist stuff, but that's not the important stuff I do. The important stuff I do is political and historical and psychological stuff, and then I understand it through that theoretical lens. But the theory does not come first. And if I have multiple things that contradict the theory, I need a better theory. And the last thing I'll say that left needs to do is be non-sectarian, but don't cower it out and even attack other leftist ideas. But notice I said ideas. All right. I do not say people. I will very rarely call someone out personally unless I see them as actively betraying. All right. And I actually think you need to have a really high bar for that. It is not just like, oh, they acted conservative or they said some reactionary bullshit on Twitter or whatever. People do that. And we should probably, I'm not saying as a community we shouldn't be policing them, and policing is the wrong way, but regulating and incorporating them, helping them. All right. I used to have pretty reactionary views on gender. I really did. I totally admit it. That has been changed by coming back to the United States. That has been changed by things I've seen by LGBTQ people, particularly the T, when I was in places where it was a lot more dangerous in the United States, and it really kind of broke my heart. And that, again, is knowing people. But I will say a lot of leftists do know a lot of queer people. So that's not our problem. I would speak out about that. The other thing I would say is, like, we need to more than superficially through quotas include women in our movement, particularly our media movement. And I don't really know how to do that because I've tried, and what's happened is I've seen the audience treat women differently in a way that even when they're not being sexist or any of that, are openly thirsty or any of that, there's still some kind of small thing that I noticed that the transaction is different, and people are alienated by that. Maybe that's something innate. I hope not. I don't want to entertain that too much, but I just see it so much. But what's interesting is left activist spaces are not. There's actually in the opposite gender balance, so it's really strange. So we need to do something about that too. And I don't mean in this like airy-fairy theoretical, just throw the word intersectional into things way. We need to look at why this may not be attractive to particularly single mothers. All right.
You mean sitting around talking Marxist theory isn't like that's not what the ladies are watching late at night on a Friday night as we're talking well into it's already tomorrow in some places, I'm sure, where people are watching.
Right. Yeah, of course. Like why
when
would
the kids crying and all.
I know my partner leaves the room when I do this for more than an hour, and she agrees with me. So
and my partner is very subtly saying, "I'm hungry. I want to go to dinner. Can we?"
You should go. You should go feed your wife.
Yeah.
But I mean, like that's what we need to do, and we need to do all of it more often. I just kind of think. I don't think we shouldn't do this Angela Nagel thing where we fetishize normie-them. But we should realize that we have to offer people something tangible. We can't just demand, we're going to ask everything of you and give you something after the revolution. No one's going to buy that shit.
Exactly. And I think that studying up on history and I'm pursuing a degree, but just stuff I've been reading, like you realize that that's part of the fun of being on the left is the reading and the theory and being intellectual and arguing about it, but in such a way where, we recognize when the chips are down. Yes, we'll coalesce, even Woody Guthrie, when he wasn't writing This Land Is Your Land, like a commie anthem in reaction to, God Bless America, he was writing about, let's go kill the fascists. You know what I mean? Like we can put that argument aside for a minute and do this. If I start talking about, is there a actual left culture in like pop culture and all that stuff, we'll be here all night. Yeah. But well, geez, we got it's going to have to be.
The short answer to that is no. The long answer to that is it's complicated, and we'll talk about it another day.
Exactly. Varn, thank you for being here. See Derick Varn. You can see him on his YouTube channel. See Derick Varn.
Varn blog and Mortal Science podcast. However, I'm just going to go ahead and warn you. Mortal Science is not an entry-level Marxist podcast. Like, I don't do 101 stuff there. And I don't even, like, it's actually the opposite of almost everything I just told you to do, except that I work with a trans woman on it. So,
cool.
So take care. I hope some people got something out of this. I feel like I talk a lot.
Well, me too. My wife is always like, God, kids, she talked to, I'm like, I'm trying to monetize this shit, babe. I'm trying to monetize the yakety yak. But I think it's good for people to understand. Like, I think those of us on the left who have, been on the right or flirted with it or spent time, like, I've found it's better for me to not shy away from the fact that I got caught up in reactionary shit via new atheism, like repeating some nonsense about Islam or whatever, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because that's part of, like one day I kind of went, wait, what the fuck am I doing here? Like I'm on, this isn't my politics. This isn't who I am, but why the fuck is that? And trying to figure that out. And so I appreciate you breaking down paleo-conservative, because it tends to, like, to me, it's like almost like a snowball. Like, that's the paleo-conservative is, Tea Party is wrapped around paleo-conservative, which is, Trumpism is wrapped around that. But either way, it's great to have you on. You're also you mentioned Varn Vlog, that show. You're also your show's available on audio as well, right?
Yeah, and the audio show and the stream is actually slightly different. So, because I'm evil like that, so I kind of like, you got to follow both.
They're okay. So, yeah.
Although you don't have to monetize both. I do have a Patreon, but it's really, if you just listen to the free stuff, you'll get plenty of stuff. If you want to help me out, you can give me a review or like and share or whatever. But like,
that's good.
You don't have to give me money.
Go sub. Yeah.
But yeah, my YouTube's not monetized because I'm afraid that they'll crack down on me one day. Because I'm less careful about what I say than I should be, probably.
Oh, okay. Well, you're providing as a community service, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. Yes, you can find me on Varblog. You can find me on Mortal Science. You can find me. I'm part of the Zero Books team. I don't know when my media is going to be up. It's kind of, we're kind of in limbo, and we're kind of restructuring some things over there. What else? I'm writing a bunch of books. I'm a teacher. Bye.
Bye. All right. Thanks, Varn. We will see you around the lefty YouTube spaces in the future. But thanks again for coming on, buddy.
Thank you.
All right. So, everybody, that was Derick Varn. Thank him again in the comments. I'm going to take off. It's dinner time. It's getting very late. We're hungry. So, lots of stuff to do. I hope y'all are well. Double mask, keep it safe. Delta variant, it's a bitch out there. It's even getting people who aren't vaccinated. So, be safe. Oh, geez, you can see all my instruments in the background there. Maybe one day I'll do a music stream. But either way, thank you all for being here. Sweet thing to say, Songs 4K. And we'll see you all next time. As always, left is best. And follow me, Twitter. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @Political Payne, TikTok. I'm all over the place. See you next time. Left is best.